about any of those things. In many cases, charities are operating with really poor infrastructure, outdated computers, inadequate logistics, and that's because spending money on those kinds of things comes out as overhead, and overhead is penalized in a rating system like that of Charity Navigator. So the organizations don't want to have a poor rating, and so they don't spend on these resources. But if you don't have the right kind of logistics, equipment, infrastructure, technology, IT, etc., to do your work, then you might be working very hard and have very diligent employees, and they're doing a lot more work than is necessary to achieve the impact that they're having.
The 990 dataset is for tax reporting, but like with any dataset, individuals use it to answer their own questions. Researchers could be politically motivated, or the research itself could have political and social consequences. The narratives included in the 990 forms are limited, and as such, our understanding of the context that each nonprofit is working in is as well.
It's also not written by the beneficiaries or by the non-beneficiaries. There are organizations that are tax exempt doing things that you might find disagreeable or that you might be vehemently opposed to. Well, they're receiving a tax exemption as well. And some people might think that what they're doing is great. Whatever you think of them, you're still paying for them with your taxes. So, because they're not paying their taxes. That's sort of another story. But I think it's just really important to be very modest in saying what you can extrapolate from these data. There's a lot that you can do with it, but to answer even a simple question requires a lot of work and a lot of qualifications,
So all of these, there are really fantastic initiatives to make this data accessible and have people interpret it in a profoundly impactful way. So you've developed open990.org, which is a free website that individuals can go to actually find readable reports on the IRS 990 dataset and download the forms themselves and allow them to do analyses. Are there other really interesting findings or use cases or software that's been developed from the IRS 990 dataset that you've seen?
Yes, there's a couple that I've really liked. One of them was this project on dark money, just looking at the networks of people who are on the boards of organizations, for example, or who donated to certain private foundations, and the kinds of trends that data journalists have been able to observe, or rather relationships that data journalists have been able to extract from that information. The Wall Street Journal had a couple of really interesting pieces based on the 990 data set. I think that what we're trying to do at Open 990 is make these public records available for inspection. Each 990, 990PF, 990EZ in the upper right-hand corner says for public inspection. So we're trying to make the data available for public inspection, and we really go out of our way not to pass any judgment on anything. So there's nothing on Open 990 that contains any judgment about what you're seeing. We don't even flag things that we think are problematic, though when we come across something that we think looks truly fraudulent, we report it ourselves to the IRS. We still don't put a notation on their Open 990 profile, for example. That's not for us to decide. So, what we're trying to do ultimately is empower other people to go out there and look at these data and draw whatever conclusions they're inclined to draw from them, and see what those conclusions are. In that sense, it's an experiment. I think that, without being too negative, it's really important to be careful not to build what you might call a weapon of math destruction. It's a book with that title, and while I didn't agree with everything in the book, I thought that they made a wonderful point, and they coined an amazing term, weapon of math destruction. Basic premise of a weapon of math destruction is when there's a question you want to answer, and it doesn't line up with the information that you have available. And so you build a model that answers something else, but you say that it answers the thing that you were after. And in so doing, you incentivize some really messed up things. When you do that, you might think, well, at least there's now some quantitative measure that's being used. But if that quantitative measure doesn't line up with what you're saying it's a quantitative measure of, you're probably doing harm instead of doing good. And that's a really big problem.
Right on that point, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back to discuss more with David about the nonprofit sector in general.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
All right, thank you, and we're back. We talked about how the 990 dataset is a key resource for many analyses in the nonprofit sector. But how are the nonprofit organizations themselves using this data to improve their services?
Well, the first thing to be aware of, sort of on technical points, there's two kinds of charitable entities, and one of them needs a lot more data help than the other in general. One is a grant-making charitable entity. Many of these are private foundations, though not all. And the distinction between a private foundation and a public charity is not worth getting into here. It's also a little not totally cut and dried. And the other kind are direct operating organizations that do something on the ground. And some organizations do a little of each. Not all private foundations are grant making. Not all public charities are direct operations. So that's a common misunderstanding. But the grant makers are a lot more in need of hard data to figure out where their dollars are going to be most effective than the public charities. You know, that's not always going to be true. Some public charities are really going to be, by their nature, data-driven. But in a lot of cases, for example, think of something like, again, a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or a shelter for people who are survivors of domestic violence, animal shelter. These are organizations that may not have a particularly strong data need, but their funders really need to be able to tell which of these organizations are effective. Because to go back to the soup kitchen example, let's say you've got two soup kitchens relatively close to each other. They're effectively business competitors. One of them is just way more effective. They are able to take up, for the amount of money that it takes them to serve 5 people, the other one can only serve 1 person. But the one that serves the 1 person makes really delicious food or really impressive menus, and so they get written up in all these newspapers because their meals are so nutritious and, improve the quality of life of their recipients so much. I'm not saying that the one that serves 5 people is better than the one that's serving 1 person, because that's not clear, right? You really need to get on the ground to figure out which one is providing the greater service. But what you do know is that they are each competing for the same dollars within a geographic locale if they're serving the same community. And they may not be working synergistically to reduce the total hunger burden within that community. There's fixed costs of operating both of them, and they're both paying them. So knowing that, a funder might do well to figure out which one is providing the greatest consequential benefit to the community, setting aside which one looks better. And again, I'm not sure which one of those looks better, and deciding which one you want to fund, or if they're both meritorious and deserve funding, and to what extent. But the soup kitchen itself may not need much in the way of data. Maybe they need help when they're first figuring out where to put the soup kitchen. But oftentimes, let's be honest here, you know where you need a soup kitchen. You don't need deep demographic analysis to figure out that there's hunger in a particular place, or that you're near where people who might be hungry would be working. It would be convenient for them to get there.
So, yeah, I think that's a key insight, accepting that, nonprofits are in competition with one another, whether that's for clients or for funding. And as we like to develop collaborative approaches, that's always not possible, especially in data where many organizations like to have proprietary data, whether that's not only just from privacy concerns about who they're serving, but about who else could interfere or potentially take over some of those operations and take some funding away. Did you actually encounter any problems with that where people were wary of publishing certain data online?
Oh, brother. Yeah.
Yep.
We get complaints every day. We get people saying, take our profile offline. I never gave you permission to display these data. I love that one because I point to their signature and with digital signature on the file.
On the form.
I'm pretty sure you signed a form on the top right corner of which says for public inspection, and you said, I agree to these terms, and then it's true and accurate. If you don't understand what you're signing, that's really not my there are more morally ambiguous cases. You have to put a phone number when you're founding a nonprofit, and sometimes people don't realize where that phone number is going to appear, that it's part of the public record, and they're doing something that might put them at personal risk. Perhaps we've had a couple of organizations that deal with sex trafficking, and there's a lot of money to be made in sex trafficking. So people who are fighting it are going up against people who are obviously, by definition, not opposed to cruelty and violence. Publishing their phone number or, heaven forbid, their personal address, can be quite detrimental to them. Even some shelters, their address is not widely known, so it winds up on a website that can make it more difficult for them to provide effective services. So
given that, where do we go next for open data in the nonprofit sector? And whether that's with the 990 dataset or with the tools to read the 990 dataset, but we've identified some clear challenges, one being accessibility. Are there other things that we can be doing to solve some of these problems in the next couple of years? Or where do you see your own work going?
For myself, my goal with Open 990 has always been to create an adequate amount of information to allow the public to really be able to use these records that they're subsidizing. You subsidize every tax-exempt organization with your tax dollars. Once I've done that, my partner and I, my partner Heather Kogelmass and I have been working on this together. I don't really see any need to be focusing my attention on the nonprofit sector itself anymore. But in terms of sort of the next stages of data science on the nonprofit sector, I think there's a real need to be able to find organizations that are similar to one another in order to do the kind of due diligence that nonprofits need to do. By finding organizations that are similar to you, you can find grant makers who have funded them to sustain your operations. You can also find out how much they're compensating their executives in order to set fair compensation for your own executives. You can find out how much money they're bringing in, how much money they're spending to make sure that you are, your operations are up to par with the standard for organizations that are like yours. For grant makers, there's an opportunity to find organizations that really fit a very specific profile of what they're interested in, where before that might have been quite difficult to do, and they would have depended on the needle in the haystack approach of asking for applications and then having to sort through them. But there's not a lot of text. So first of all, the only way that we have to do that before we had these big data was this thing called an NTE code, which there's only one assigned to each organization. Trying to put every organization into a bucket means you're either going to need so many buckets, single bucket, you're going to need so many buckets that you're not